and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and I'm joined today by Rory Sutherland, our weekly columnist. Rory, thanks for joining me. You write for the magazine this week that we are in desperate need of a madmen era of politics. What do you mean?
I think our political class is dominated and our decision making is dominated by lawyers and economists. In fact, Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning economist, ironically said, and he said it as a criticism, that the US government is run by lawyers who occasionally take advice from economists. Anybody interested in helping the economists out need not apply. And we have, and you see it in the profusion of Oxford PPE graduates, you have a vast overdominance of particular mindsets in political and governmental decision making. And one of the costs we pay for this, I think, I made the point in my article that voting Labour, but then getting a chancellor who's a Bank of England economist by training, is a bit like going on a Club 1830 holiday and taking your parents along. It kind of defeats the object of the exercise. And one of the things I would have hoped to see from a change of government is a government that had the capability to be pretty extravagant in a few areas. And one area where I'd particularly like to see it would be infrastructure expenditure, including but not confined to house building. And we've created a world where in order for anything to happen, it requires permission from a lawyer and an economist. And economists set the bar in many cases far too high, the bar of proof, if you like. In other words, you have to do a precise cost-benefit analysis for anything using an economic model. I would argue there are a lot of things, particularly transport infrastructure expenditure, where the economic model will very frequently undervalue the gains from infrastructure expenditure, because I think gains from infrastructure expenditure actually compound over time. They're a bit like your pension. It's not a linear benefit. Effectively, when you provide infrastructure, lots and lots of new economic activity can happen on the back of it. And that infrastructure would include road building, investment in trains. It would also include better broadband connectivity, and in the UK particularly, much less crappy mobile connectivity, where I think our mobile service in Britain is an embarrassment compared to countries like Greece and Portugal, for example. And when you invest in those things, the benefits grow effectively exponentially over time. The Victorians spent massively on infrastructure. There was huge economic growth. I think that's causation, not correlation. Now, when you demand that everything has to make perfect economic sense in advance, and it also has to pass ridiculous hoops of legal approval, it becomes impossible to do anything, okay? With one exception, actually, which is if you propose something truly massive, like High Speed 2 or hosting the Olympics, all the new normal criteria effectively get ignored, because those are big enough to kind of reach escape velocity. And often those things are actually rather stupid. Whereas in order to get something medium-sized done, first of all, people can now, I don't mind legal challenges which stop things happening. But increasingly, the effect of legal challenges is to provide a degree of friction for any kind of useful economic activity, which makes the whole thing just insanely painful and bureaucratic and time-consuming, to a point where nobody can be bothered to do anything at all. And then you have these economic models, which I think are perfectly healthy in certain contexts, but in the field of infrastructure, I think they're fundamentally wrong-headed. I think it was PJ O'Rourke, who's a bit of a hero of mine, who said, look, as a right-wing person, I don't get that grumpy when the government builds a bridge, because it may not be the best use of your money, but at least you have a bridge. And so this combination of lawyers and economists and the domination of those two modes of thought in our political class is not only problematic in terms of it actually prevents economic growth because you set the burden of proof far too high. You make experimentation very difficult because everything you do has to make sense in advance and has to be quantified in advance. If you'd asked Christopher Columbus to do a cost-benefit analysis, he never would have been able to leave port. never mind the fact that he'd probably have to do an environmental impact study and a health and safety report before he even boarded the boat. Okay, so we have this absurd amount of friction which is being created, but also it's fundamentally problematic because they're both quite boring disciplines. If you look at really interesting people, you may hate Elon Musk, okay? It's not boring, okay? The really interesting people, the entrepreneurs, are usually, if you like, they're neurodiverse. Greg Jackson of Octopus Energy would be a really interesting case in point of someone who's just remarkably unusual in his approach to thinking. Same with Bezos, for example. Same with most really interesting entrepreneurs. And instead, our mode of thinking is constrained by these fundamentally kind of tedious disciplines, which have no appetite for fun or pleasure, which only value those things that they can measure, but also they don't believe in magic. And I know that sounds a ridiculous thing to say, but there are lots and lots of things that happen in life, penicillin to take one example, or the air fryer, okay, which are kind of magic. Okay, this doesn't arise from a trade-off. Economics always looks at everything through the lens of a trade-off, because when you have a trade-off, you have a single point optimization problem, which means you come up with a single defensible solution or response to a problem, which can't be argued with. Actually, the best things in life aren't the result of a trade-off, they're a result of something akin to a miracle. And if you have these dismal people, lawyers and economists who don't believe in magic, one, they won't look for magic in the first place, and secondly, they'll refuse to believe in it when evidence is presented to them. And I genuinely think it's a problem.
Rory, isn't the problem that there's no incentive for the entrepreneurs, the people who have these incredible visions for the world, to go into politics? As you say, if you look at the bureaucracy surrounding the state and everything that it encompasses, why would those who believe in magic opt to do that kind of job? They would, of course, stay in the private sector where they can innovate.
One of the interesting things is there are very interesting people in politics. I mean, there are people I know who are MPs. I mean, I'll give Jesse Norman as an example, who are genuinely extraordinary people. His wife probably even more extraordinary, but they don't stick around very long. And it seems to me there's a kind of immune response in politics that anybody who's a deviant thinker effectively, the immune system serves to kind of eject them or constrain them. I mean, if you look at people who aren't conventional, what you might call legal economic members of the autistocracy, whether it's Trump or Boris Johnson, okay, whenever one of these people emerges, everything in the establishment does everything they possibly can to set the white blood cells of the establishment upon them. And I think, by the way, I think that populism, which is often wrongly conflated with kind of nationalism or racism, partly emerges from the fact that most people making decisions at the highest level are doing so on the basis of mental models, which are 2 or 3 stages removed from everyday life as it's lived.
Rory, I thought this was a very interesting part of your column where you talk about popularism. You say it's not actually about migration. That's not the number one issue on people's mind. The problem is that they think that any area of public policy, whether it be immigration or something to do with the public finances, whether it be education or healthcare, they think that the public policy is set. And lawyers say no, and economists say, if you do this, the economy will collapse. I mean, look at what's happened around the winter fuel allowance. You had ministers suggesting that if you didn't cut £1.5 billion worth of spending, which is a heck of a lot of money, but pennies compared to the overall spend of the Treasury in a fiscal year, that there'd be a run on the pound, that the economy would collapse. The idea that everything is always on the brink and nothing can be done is ultimately what frustrates the public.
Yeah, and partly, by the way, it's not only what is done, but the speed at which it happens. Because it's incomprehensible to most people that the government isn't all powerful. The people vote for a government on the assumption that it can do the things they ask it to do. And this idea, I think, increasingly of what's sometimes called lawfare, where people use legal mechanisms to effectively attain political ends, or more likely to thwart effectively policies and behaviors which are actually the will of the people, is deeply damaging to our faith in democracy. Because we do effectively, one of the reasons we're happy to defer power to a government is the belief that they can actually affect things that we can't individually. And when government becomes increasingly ineffectual because it's tied up either in kind of ludicrous kind of economic theories, which I'm not wholly convinced by the need for austerity to the extent to which it's delivered. I think there should be areas in which government is actually conspicuously extravagant. As I said, infrastructure expenditure. There was a very interesting libertarian governor of New Mexico in the US, a guy called Gary Johnson, and he basically he was a little like Ron Swanson on Parks and Recreation, in that he hated most forms of government expenditure and slashed them viciously, with two exceptions, which were education and investment in roads and infrastructure, where he spent lavishly. He effectively had the slogan, if you want to have economic growth, you've got to have a 4-lane highway. And I would argue that one of the interesting things, which is a simple comparative experiment, is if you go to 3 countries, Portugal, Spain, or Greece, I would argue that to an extraordinary extent, they pissed money up the wall on infrastructure to an astounding degree. I mean, Spain has far too many airports, for example. It's utterly ridiculous. And the airports they have are too big. However, and this is an important qualification, those 3 countries, in terms of quality of life and, you might argue, economic performance, have actually benefited rather a lot. And I'm not proposing levels of infrastructure expenditure or indeed building on the level of say Spain 15 years ago. But our complete incapacity to build is just an embarrassment. It's ridiculous. I mean, by the way, I mean, actually challenging NIMBYism is a moment whose time has come. I mean, the extent to which people who live in cities are allowed to object to bars opening on the basis of noise pollution or something, or because people might be outside the bar at 11 o'clock at night. I'm sorry, if you're going to bed before 11 o'clock at night, you shouldn't live in a city. Piss off and go and live in an island somewhere. The extent to which people seem to think they have the right to live in urban settings but demand rural levels of quiet. One of the reasons France is quite successful economically in its weird kind of way is actually there's a lot of noisy and there's a lot of ugly in France. Now they have got more space, okay? But one of the interesting things about France is there's extraordinary sort of tolerance of noise. There's extraordinary lack of resistance to, for example, road building or rail building. For the most part, you do get pockets of protest, but a large part of the value of that kind of thing, whether it's nuclear power stations or whether it's high-speed rail, which I'm slightly skeptical about. Undoubtedly, however, we can see cases where what you might call medium-sized pieces of investment in infrastructure and building, High-Speed 1 would be an extraordinary case study, for instance, really contribute to economic elevation. I mean, East Kent has been a combination, I suppose, of flexible working and High-Speed 1 has kind of completely transformed that economy. And I think the extent to which everything we do takes too long, costs too much, and requires, I've got a vague memory that the tunnel across the Thames that connects Kent with Essex, before a single spade of earth has been dug, it's cost about the same price as actually building a tunnel in other countries. And I think the paperwork runs to 600,000 pages on the overall report. I mean, this is really a kind of econo-legal form of wealth extraction on an extraordinary scale. You could probably add management consultancies into the mix as well as the third horseman of the bureaucratic apocalypse.
I should note that Gary Johnson was also a 2016 presidential candidate in the US, and
he was, tragically, if only. Right.
Few of us thought he was the best candidate. Few of us thought he was far better than the two mainstream options. I want to talk about this point about infrastructure. It's so important because I think people are moving in your direction, Rory. There seems to be a growing consensus that one of the major problems in the UK is that simply nothing gets built. But there are two major issues here. One you've already touched upon, and that is NIMBYism. And it is that horrible combination that your article talks about where the planning regulation and, the ability to use the law to shut down absolutely any kind of planning development, it creates a scenario where very little often gets built. But we have another problem too, and that brings us back to the politics of this, that every government, every hopeful government, dare I say, actually every opposition, talks about capital spending. They talk about the need for more infrastructure, for more economic growth. But then they get into power, they've got 4 to 5 years, and they look at day-to-day spending and they look at what's really popular with the public, and that's cash now for the health service, for education. And successive governments, and not just governments, but political parties, Labour and Tory, have raided those capital spending budgets for day-to-day spending. And this is across the political spectrum. Everybody gets in there. They have these hopeful dreams about what could be built in 10, 15 years, but instead they spend the money on day-to-day spending. What do you do about that? How do you change those incentives? That's incredibly tricky for a politician to say, you know what, we're going to have to make some tough decisions on these things that I know the public cares most about, because in 15 years, we're going to have a fantastic rail station. We're going to have a new airport. We're going to have green energy infrastructure, which actually really will reduce your bills in the long term. But that doesn't help them get elected in 5 years' time.
Well, first of all, you can do something which should be done much more often, which is just to come completely clean with the public.
Very daring.
Politicians who have done so have repeatedly succeeded. Secondly, the extent to which the headline announcement is always about more money rather than more innovation. I mean, the potential for innovation in healthcare is significant. The third thing I would argue is that government doesn't really have a marketing function. Politics has a massive PR function in terms of press relations, and indeed is dangerously over-obsessed, I would argue, with press reporting and public opinion in that kind of very shallow kind of media way. But in terms of understanding the reason those companies, okay, if you look at the companies that have really survived in the Fortune 500 or the FTSE, okay, they tend to be kind of Unilever, Procter and Gamble, okay, Reckitt Benckiser, Nestle. And the reason they survive is they have, and John Kay writes about this in his recent book, The Corporation in the 21st Century, they have a large marketing function which concentrates on continually staying relevant to what consumers want. And I don't think government has I think both of those two disciplines, law and economics, are slightly aspergic, in that they understand numbers and models, but they're not very good at understanding people or reality. And one of the things, and this is slightly contentious, okay, but I will say it is quite cheap, relatively speaking, to improve the patient experience from the NHS. Now, if you're a purist, you only measure sort of quality of health outcomes, and you have some economic model in terms of quality adjusted life years. And that stuff's really important. I'm not disputing that. But the better businesses know that consumers also care about trivial things like how you're treated, whether you're treated with respect, whether people answer the telephone, that kind of detail. And I think, there's an opportunity for public services to get much, much better at this kind of thing, but they don't really have a marketing function of asking, what does value really mean to people in terms of what are the things that actually materially improve their lives as distinct from pure economic measures of wealth. Now, the biggest nonsense that emerged from that is generally economics assumes that the richer people are, the better off they are. But if house prices are going up ridiculously and the rising house prices are benefiting the old at the expense of the young, you have a fundamental problem. And we've ignored this problem because for some utterly bizarre reason, rising house prices were presented as a good news story for 30 years without interruption, more or less. We've ignored this problem because economics doesn't properly understand it, I think. I mean, economics has some very strange ideas. I mean, it's, what are the forms of human activity, for example? I mean, it's very interesting, by the way, when we talk about things like, Labour's policy for a 4-day working week. Well, economically, that's bad news if people are working less hard. You could equally argue that the two-income household has forced most families to sacrifice 35 hours of discretionary leisure time per family per week. Most of the economic gains, I would argue, from the second party entering the workforce have gone either in the form of taxation to the government or in the form of rising property prices, and haven't really translated into the same improvement in quality of life that you would reasonably expect.
I might add one in there too, Rory, that's childcare. It's so incredibly expensive in the UK,
Yeah.
some of the highest costs in the OECD.
Well, of course, in an economic model, if you fire your cleaner, or you marry your cleaner, or you effectively fire your nanny and start doing the job yourself, that's actually a drop in GDP, of course, because what's measured is only those things which actually manifest themselves in financial transactions. And government hasn't really delved deeply enough into everyday people's lives and concerns and what bothers them. Instead, it's used economics as a ridiculous proxy for human happiness, and the extent to which GDP figures dominate. Now, the reason I think that's fundamentally problematic is that there are lots of ways in which you can have rising wealth but declining happiness, for instance.
So, Rory, can I ask you a bit more about that and challenge it slightly? What metrics would you use? And presumably GDP would still be one of them. I completely take your point that GDP is not able to capture, especially over the course of one's lifetime or even working life, what might truly be improving their situation or society's situation in the moment. For example, if a woman takes a year or two off to raise children across the course of an entire career, GDP will say one thing, but I think we would say something, perhaps far more positive about that approach or far more balanced, and think there should be support for that kind of decision.
Well, as a conservative, the family or the household, depending on how you want to, I don't want to be so bourgeois as to suggest it has to be a nuclear family, but the unit of the household has to be a particular item of consideration.
But wouldn't we also say that
Okay.
GDP still has a very important place in this measurement? Because we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. When economic growth increases, we're talking about increased wages, we're talking about more job opportunities, we're talking about building, we're talking about things that you were talking about, which is really, being able to create more wealth in a society. That is still a very important metric.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, this is why I'm slightly sympathetic with the flexible working movement, because the point of, say, conservatism, the point of capitalism, is that you continually discover new forms of value exchange which benefit two parties. All right? That's broadly speaking what business is it's a process of discovery for new forms of value exchange. And one of them may well be that people would rather earn 20% less and live by the seaside. Okay, I'm in Ibiza at the moment. If you go to any of the Canary Islands, you'll see this growth in nomadic working, which I think is a decision by people to say, look, I'll probably earn 20% less, but actually I'll have a much better quality of life. And if you kick in lower house prices, I'm probably quids in. So you have to allow people to discover their own forms and own definitions of wealth. And by the way, I would argue that, generally infrastructure spending and expenditure on housing, if you discard the very, very narrow group of NIMBYs who live immediately next door, it generally is also interesting because it tends, when done well, to bring benefits to people regardless of whether they're rich or poor, by the way. But no, I think GDP is, a useful and interesting indicator. Okay, it's not a bad metric, but should it be a target? Because we all know Goodhart's law. Okay, any metric that becomes a target kind of loses its value as a metric because it becomes pursued for its own sake.
Well, where we're certainly in agreement, Rory, is that what the market is so good at is providing that choice, not just to employers, certainly to workers, to be able to pursue the kinds of careers and lives that they want. But I'm interested in your thoughts on this because just recently we've had the new business secretary talking about giving the right to work from home or where you'd like to work from to all employees as something that's fundamental. You as a business owner, what do you make of that? surely it's different when the state says, basically, I'm going to turn this into a law to the point of your piece, rather than employers and employees having the flexibility to negotiate this and work it out for themselves.
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I think fully remote work is possible. I don't think it's necessarily desirable. I buy the argument.
But what about this point about making it a legal right?
Why I have a sympathy, the two people who've written the most about what's called the double income trap, okay, which is it is now unaffordable unless you work for Goldman Sachs to bring up a family and maintain a household on one income alone, okay? The two biggest critics of that are the two people who spotted the problem. I don't want to look like some old sexist who's suggesting people should get back in the kitchen. Okay, I'm being absolutely clear about that. The two people who've written and spoken most eloquently about that were Fay Weldon and Senator Elizabeth Warren. Senator Elizabeth Warren, by the way, who's the Democratic senator of Massachusetts, interests me because she seems almost entirely sane and interesting, but for some reason in the United States is treated like a lunatic. But she has actually written a whole book about the double income trap, which also points out that it actually reduces the resilience of a household. Because previously, the second income was something that could kick in if the other party lost their job. Now, if you require two incomes to actually maintain a household, one person losing their job ends up, effectively leading to catastrophic outcomes. In the US, it's slightly different because you have this crazy thing where house prices in good school districts effectively mop up an awful lot of the gains from the double income household, because you now have two incomes. As soon as you have children, you have to move into a household in a good school district, and that then effectively the money goes to the homeowner.
Well, Rory, if you want to know, I think one frustration with Elizabeth Warren from people on the right who are really sympathetic to the ideas that she put forward in that book. And from memory, when she talks about the double income trap, she talks in America about how families feel like they're forced to move to these areas where homes are double, triple the price because of the school district. And in the book, she talks about how great it might be to give parents more flexibility about where they send their children to school, an idea that was completely lost once she became a Democratic senator. So I think maybe that might be part of the frustration. That
So was she a kind of voucher system proponent?
I can't remember if she actually
elected?
advocated for a full-on voucher program, but she diagnosed the problem completely, that without parents having some more flexibility and choice about where they send their kids to school, you're always going to fall into this trap of higher housing costs. And then, that's not something that the Democratic Party, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's some great congressmen and women and senators who do talk about this, but that is not a position that the Democratic Party takes. And I think that was definitely one of the areas of frustration.
I mean, the question of the distribution of leisure is quite interesting, because I think working people who pay an inordinate amount of income tax, okay, people in jobs basically fund the whole thing. And we've had 20 years of what I'd call gerontophile government, which indulges pensioners to an extraordinary degree, okay? Not always wrongly, but we've got to remember the pensioners now did not fight in World War II. They didn't even have to cope with post-World War II austerity. I have a certain sympathy with my dad. He was born in 1930. The current crop of pensioners are kind of were basically born in about 1950 and spent their youth at the Isle of Wight Festival or something, right? Okay, it's not the same level of hardship to which we owe this extraordinary debt. They're not doing anything, okay? They're in many cases perfectly healthy, but economically totally inactive. And then we have this expansion of further education and higher education. So what we're doing is we're increasingly having leisured or economically non-productive lives at the beginning and at the end of our lives, and hammering all the costs on the people in the middle who are actually doing productive work. And some sort of effectively intergenerational sensitivity to this is, I think, a little bit overdue. I mean, I find it completely extraordinary. Okay, I'm now 58. And I keep having a financial advisor say things like, well, you can take some money out of your business and put it into your pension, and then you get a tax rebate, and then you retrieve some money, which is completely tax-free from your pension. And I go, this is great, okay, but where were all these tax breaks when I was like 38, had two young kids, and really needed the money? because there weren't any tax breaks then. And suddenly you get to this point of, in your late 50s, early 60s, where you probably paid off your mortgage. At least my generation have. God knows what the next generation will do. And then suddenly the government starts indulging you in all kinds of ways. This seems to me, fundamentally ridiculous. And meanwhile, you have 24-year-olds whose hope of buying a home really rests on doing, I would argue, on working flexibly and finding a place where you can commute into London for 2 days a week and actually find somewhere affordable that's sort of 90 or 100 miles away. The property market has messed up everything. I mean, the rent is too damn high. The cost of property is undoubtedly one of the cost of property and the cost of building and the cost of building more property, that complete bottleneck, which applies equally to other forms of infrastructure like road building and the odd airport.
Do you think more people should support the idea of flexible working precisely because the housing market is better described as a housing cartel?
Well, there's an interesting observation. I actually propose that the part of our transport budget should be just put towards giving everybody in the UK as a full Zoom account. Because I argue that the best journey you could have from the point of view of the Department of Transport is a journey that somebody doesn't make at all. Okay, it doesn't cause any congestion. It doesn't have any environmental cost or very little. Okay, and actually encouraging people where possible to do things remotely. In a sense, the very interesting finding from the railways, you see, the railways are in financial meltdown to some extent because they depended on commuter revenue from peak time season tickets to support very heavy levels of capacity provision at peak times, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, the interesting concomitant to that is that they're now in a big financial crisis, but actually levels of passenger satisfaction have rocketed up, because overcrowding is much, much less common than it was, because you only need 10% or 15% of people not to travel on a crowded train. And if you actually smooth out the peak of travel, you remove a huge amount of the kind of crunch points that normally bedevil rail travel. And so it's an opportunity for us, by the way, to say, if we were really intelligent, if government had a marketing function, we'd say, actually, we no longer need to devote the majority of, say, rail subsidy towards capacity provision. Why don't we actually spend a fraction of the money we've saved by no longer needing to provide that extreme capacity on just making railway stations and the whole rail experience really pleasant? Let's not have seats that look like bloody ironing boards. Let's actually have toilets open at stations. That stuff's actually comparatively cheap compared to the really expensive stuff. And I don't think, I think the problem we have is that quite often it's actually relatively small things that make a big difference to both the citizen experience and the passenger experience. And yet it's those things that are actually the hardest to do. As I said, there are these weird projects like hosting the Olympics or building High Speed 2, which seem to achieve some sort of weird bureaucratic escape velocity where they're not really subjected to sensible reason at all. Meanwhile, what you might call the smaller scale things like let's have a few benches at London Bridge Station so people waiting for a train don't have to sit on the floor. Okay, this is a station that costs about £500 million, and while people wait for a train, they're sitting on a metal pipe, okay? And there are no toilets. If you change trains at London Bridge Station, you have no toilet provision. Okay, these are actually, in many cases, the things we need to sort out. Trust me, if you try doing those things for all kinds of legal bureaucratic reasons, it's more or less impossible. In my local station, this is the example of the total sort of insanity you get. So I use a station called Otford, which is just outside Sevenoaks. They've just spent something like a month and a half or 2 months, and I would guess £2 million, replacing a pedestrian level crossing with a footbridge. Presumably because some legal mandate to do with health and safety requires them to do it. In the entire 20 years I've used the station, I've only seen about 15 people walk across that level crossing. It's a pedestrian level crossing, okay? The footbridge is actually totally useless to people who are disabled or elderly. The likelihood that someone injures themselves on the footbridge in icy weather is vastly greater than the likelihood that anyone crossing that track will be hit by a train, okay? The entire expenditure is totally stupid because it's basically arse covering. It's someone effectively with a legal mandate around health and safety to cover their own arse. Now, just to give an example, there are probably 5 creative alternatives you could have come up with as an alternative to building that absolutely stupid bridge, which no one in the local area wanted. In fact, most of the people in the local Otford Parish Council were dead against it. Okay, nobody wanted that bloody thing. It cost, I don't know, $1 million, I guess. I don't know, I'm guessing. You could have come up with really creative ideas, like you could just have automatic self-locking gates, which don't allow you to go onto the track if there's a train within the vicinity. To be honest, you could have put a system of lights up, okay? You know, simply to inform people after dark that whether it was safe to cross. You certainly didn't need to spend a couple of million quid on a footbridge. But the misdirection of expenditure, in particular, in that anything that's a legal mandate is effectively free of any other kind of scrutiny in terms of its expenditure, is completely moronic. And you see, I mean, the great book on this, by the way, is Dan Davis's book, The Unaccountability. It's called The Unaccountability Machine, I think it is, which is a fantastic book, precisely about this kind of ridiculous, effectively, that people seek job security in bogus regulations, in adherence to them, or indeed in effectively in application of bogus regulations. And the extent to which I think that's become a kind of weird poison. Very interesting, by the way, quote, which is kind of unintentionally funny, which my father-in-law was on the inaugural Eurostar journey through the tunnel. And he asked some of his French counterparts, how is it you can build infrastructure so quickly? And in Britain, it takes us so long and it's so expensive. To which the answer was, well, here in France, when we decide to drain the pond, we do not consult the frogs first. Now, okay, I totally support some degree of public control in terms of infrastructure construction, but it's reached a ridiculous point. By the way, note this, okay? If you propose anything, who writes into the council? Do people write in to support things? Almost never. So there's this grotesque bias where people who are broadly speaking in favor of things or pretty much neutral say nothing. Anybody who has some sort of deranged opposition to someone turning a boring, shop into a wine bar is given this extraordinary platform to basically be unreasonable. And, as I said, I mean, one of the things I'd get rid of is I think the use of, if you live in a city, okay, or a town, they're going to be kind of noisy, okay? And the extent to which people can use things like, oh my goodness, at 11 o'clock, there might be the sound of glasses being collected as an objection to someone opening a bar strikes me as fundamentally ridiculous.
Rory, you talk about a lot of problems there that need to be solved. In your magazine piece, you say that one of the big problems is that 2 critical skills, winning arguments and solving problems, are wildly different and they don't often cohabit the same brain. Dare I ask, which skill do you think you possess?
I think I actually migrated through working in advertising and marketing from being pretty focused on argumentation. I was Oxbridge educated person. You write an essay, you go and attend a supervision. Okay. I was effectively optimized for argumentation. Then I realized actually through exposure to the world of business, in particular through marketing, that in real life, most things don't have a single definitive right answer. In fact, and actually the best response is not necessarily provably the best response in advance. I learned that you have to experiment far more because, and I suppose I learned also that actually this great thing that Gary Klein says, that the real proof, what you gain through experience in any field, isn't actually reasoning power, it's situational awareness. And what you'll see in experienced cops or experienced military people or anything of the kind, or indeed experienced business people, is they have a situational awareness which goes, usually this, but this time it's different. They notice something that's, an outlier, an anomaly, something that's counterintuitive, and they deploy discretionary decision making accordingly. And of course, if you're a military person, the consequences of getting that wrong are quite high, so you generally get quite good at it, and I think I've become much, much less impressed by what you might call James O'Brienism. as I get older, which is James O'Brienism is kind of a form of Jesuitical reasoning where you basically pick your variables to start with. You then work them into a sequential and logically consistent argument. You write QED at the end, and you then basically pretend that nothing more is to be said on the matter because you have fundamentally settled it through the power of reasoning, despite the fact that the actual argument was probably based on axioms or assumptions which are highly questionable to begin with. Okay? And I find that what you might call, James O'Brien Jesuitism increasingly dangerous because it's fundamentally kind of unimaginative. And what people fundamentally do is they're not interested in making a decision. What they want to do is to be provably right about something. And I think there are just more good ideas you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. Genuinely, I think, okay, let's look at scientific progress, right? Penicillin, okay, Viagra, let's look at, okay, the smallpox vaccine, okay? All of those things emerged from someone noticing something weird and doing something really interesting with the information. It was actually observation that was the crucial initial catalyst for those areas of progress. It was noticing something unexpected. And that's actually noticing things very, very closely related, I would argue, to comedy and humor. I would say the skills required for comedy and humor are quite close to that, to problem solving, because it's let's look at this in 6 different ways and see if one of the ways yields something interesting, rather than let us start with an accepted theory on how this works, and let us then effectively solve for the model in accordance with the theory and assume that what solves for the model solves for reality, which is largely speaking what happens if you have to justify everything in advance. The way you justify things in advance is by making a whole series of assumptions that allow you to arrive at a conclusion. But actually, it's the extent to which your assumptions are wrong, okay? In some ways, okay, what entrepreneurs do, what successful business people do, is they don't try and be right. They try and notice something that everybody else is wrong about, because that's where the kind of opportunity for profit and competitive advantage really lies. It's a big, free market capitalism is a big, ongoing, expensive and inefficient process.
Well, perhaps solving the problem is what actually wins you the argument.
If only, yeah. But as Dominic Cummings observed, a good, as a politician, a good showing on the Today programme does a lot more for your career than actually solving a persistent problem like recidivist crime or indeed the housing crisis.
Rory, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.